Studies Wednesday seminar on mechanisms contributing to China's technological progress. I'm Manushka Saxena, a research intern at ICS, and I shall be facilitating the session today. The seminar would aim to document China's meteoric rise over a relatively short period of time in global technological innovation rankings. It will also explore the mechanisms the Chinese government has leveraged and adopted to promote innovation and technology development inside the country and to facilitate the inward flow of knowledge and technology from overseas. Finally, a speaker today shall also share his views on what the future might hold for China's scientific progress, technological development, and innovation capabilities. Joining us as the chair for the session today is Professor Varaprasad Dola. He is a professor in Chinese Studies and the former chairperson of the Center for East Asian Studies, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Currently, he teaches courses on Chinese history and development and inequality in China and India. Joining us as a speaker today is Professor Ramakrishna Velamuri. He is a professor and dean of the School of Management, Mahindra University. He was previously on the faculty of China-Europe International Business School, where he held the Chengwei Capital Chair in Entrepreneurship, and on that of the IESE Business School as well. The complete bios of our chair and speaker can be perused on the ICS website. Before we initiate the proceedings of the session, I request the audience to follow some housekeeping rules. All participants are requested to stay muted during the presentations. Questions and comments can be posed in the chat box at any time during the event, or one can raise their Zoom virtual hand during the interactive session at the end. Please unmute yourself only when called upon by the facilitator or the chair to do so. The proceedings, as a final disclaimer, will be recorded and live streamed on the ICS YouTube channel. Without further ado, I now hand over the floor to our chair, Professor Dola, to take the proceedings forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Manushka. It is indeed a pleasure for me to be here and chair this session on a very important theme that has been chosen by the Institute of Chinese Studies. In fact, ICS has been facilitating very interesting discussions on various facets of science, technology, and innovation from time to time, both in its Wednesday seminar editions, as well as in the annual conferences. In fact, I do recall speaking at ICS on a similar theme, science and technology in China, 3 decades of policy, progress, and polity, way back in 2010. And of course, more recently on science, technology, and innovation at a conference in 2018. It is indeed a delight for me to chair today's session on the theme of mechanisms contributing to China's technological progress by Professor S. Ramakrishna Velamuri. And I'm sure his expertise in management and business studies would have a very interesting bearing on his exposition on the theme that has been chosen. A few remarks before Professor Velamuri takes over. In fact, technology is one of the driving forces of economic growth, which in turn plays a pivotal role in the rise of a country. And a few countries replicated this phenomenon in history, during Industrial Revolution and then thereafter in the 20th century, both in UK, Germany, France, and US. And China is one of the late entrants into this gamut. But what distinguishes China is the span of time that it took and the scale and the breadth of this technological progress. But this needs to be juxtaposed with the impressive development of technical know-how that existed prior to 1500, as Joseph Needham so beautifully, captured for us and documented for us. And coming to the theme, for today, as by way of a few remarks. In fact, we do find multiplicity of mechanisms undergirds the recent technological progress in China. In fact, they include both legal and illegal, to put it differently, fair and unfair mechanisms. And the legal and the fair mechanisms range from a holistic vision that Tang Xiaoping underscored as science and technology being the crux of four modernizations of agriculture, industry, science and technology, and of course, defense. And the unfair, or illegal mechanisms in some ways include intellectual theft or IPR violations. And I hope Professor Velamuri would actually highlight on both these elements. With these remarks, I request Professor Velamuri to take his time, as it has been indicated that we will have plenty of time for discussion later. But first, let's listen to what Professor Ramakrishna Velamuri has to say on this very important theme. Yeah, over to Professor Velamuri.
Thank you so much, Professor Dola, for that very interesting introduction. I think, before I say anything more, I will just say that I want to thank also Professor Alka Acharya for inviting me to this webinar series. And to Professor, I want to thank Professor Venkatraman of IIM Indore for suggesting my name to Professor Acharya. I'm conscious that I'm addressing a group of China scholars with deep China expertise. Just to give you a very brief background, I spent 14 years on the faculty of a leading Chinese business school, China-Europe International Business School. I was based in Shanghai. The school has large campuses in Beijing and Shenzhen also. And I used to travel frequently to these cities to teach. We also had campuses in Ghana, in the city of Accra. And we acquired a school in Switzerland about 4 to 5 years ago. Most of my students at the CEIBS were Chinese students. This is a purely postgraduate school. And so, and we had arguably the largest executive MBA program in the world, with an intake of approximately 800 students. So these were students roughly 40 years old and who were studying and working at the same time. This experience of 14 years in China gave me the opportunity to interact with entrepreneurs and business executives. And approximately until 2015, between 25 and 30% of our participants in our programs were also government officials and managers of state-owned enterprises, both central state-owned enterprises and provincial state-owned enterprises. Until, of course, the Xi Jinping government put a stop to government departments and SOEs sponsoring their managers to EMBA programs. We can talk about this later if you are interested, and the whys of this decision. But we felt that the decision was quite unfortunate because we found that the government officials and the state-owned enterprise managers brought in very interesting perspectives, and they benefited hugely from the management education. There is no doubt that state-owned enterprises are actually significantly less efficient than the private sector. We could see, tangibly the progress that these managers were making after attending our program. The other important point that Professor Dolla made, which is that we should not forget China's economic development in the 1500s and 1600s. And one of the questions that Chinese scholars have asked, and even Western scholars have asked, is why did the Industrial Revolution not take place in China? Unfortunately, that is not the topic of today's discussion, although as economic historians have had a lot to say. In addition to Needham, there's been Joel Mukhair at Northwestern University and other Chinese scholars who've discussed this at great length. But suffice it to say, I think you all know that there is a deep sense of anguish that China missed out on the Industrial Revolution. In fact, many of the technologies and inventions that China had pioneered before the Industrial Revolution, well before the Industrial Revolution, diffused or gained diffusion during the Industrial Revolution in Europe, but some of them several hundred years later. Okay. But let me just take you back to the presentation today. And I just want to start off by reminding you all of the point that was made by Professor Dolla, that science and technology was always, central to Deng Xiaoping's vision. He referred to the 4 modernizations: industry, defense, agriculture, and science and technology. And this was, and if you look at, post the demise of Chairman Mao and the whole reform and opening up period, and since then, we can see that globally there were several technological waves. During the 80s, there was the PC, the personal computer wave. And then the semiconductor chip, became more and more efficient in terms of its processing speeds and more efficient in terms of storing information on smaller and smaller surface areas. This has been well documented by those who study technology. In the 90s, there was the mobile telephone wave. In the 2000s, starting with 2007 especially, we had the smartphone revolution. And in the last 10 years, we've had, a convergence, of all these technologies, along with 4G and 5G that have made possible the Internet of Things, that have made possible big data, and that have made possible a whole host of new technologies, digital technologies, and that have led to the digitization of the economy. I would state that there is no other major economy in the world that has leveraged these technological waves more effectively than China. And we'll see some evidence of that in the coming slides. So as I said, for Mr. Deng Xiaoping, science and technology were actually very primary productive forces. And the Chinese leadership has really focused on upgrading China's innovation and technology in multiple areas. So as far as today's agenda is concerned, I would like to share with you some indicators of China's technological progress. I think this will not be new to this audience, so I'll go through this part very quickly. And then I will talk about 4 broad mechanisms. One is just the resource allocation, the massive resource allocation that the Chinese government has made, demonstrating their strategic intent. And the second one is the investment in human capital. You will know very well that around 1949, we gained independence in 1947 in India. The People's Republic of China was founded in some sense in 1949. And although both countries were very poor at that time, or let me take it forward to around 1980. 1980, after Chairman Mao passed away, we have good data on this. Both countries were very poor in 1980, but China's human capital was significantly higher than India's. They had better literacy. They had a healthier population. They had a population that was less unequal than the Indian population. And there was less social stratification in China. But China has actually built on this very strong starting point of a well-developed human capital base. And it has significantly improved it over the next 3 to 4 decades. The third mechanism that I'll talk about is the trade and investment policy. And the fourth one is a knowledge acquisition from overseas. So I just want to make it very clear that these are by no means, these four mechanisms are by no means exhaustive in terms of being contributors to China's technological progress, but I think they are very important. And even within each mechanism, I will not be able to cover every initiative that was taken by the Chinese government. So this presentation is more to give you an idea of the kinds of things that have been done and for us to have a debate about this. And finally, we can talk about what can we expect in the future, given the changes that have taken place, particularly, I would say, in the last year to 18 months. So let's look at some indicators of China's innovation and technology outcomes. So there's a very well-researched report that's produced every year. It's called the Global Innovation Index. It's freely available. It can be downloaded from the web. And China has been continuously improving its rankings on this index. So in the last index, which is the GII, Global Innovation Index 2022, China ranked 11th in the world. And it was ahead of countries that are by no means laggards in innovation, such as France, Japan, Israel, Canada, and Hong Kong. China was the first ranked middle-income country, upper middle-income country in the rankings. Every country ranked above China and several ranked below China are high-income countries. India was ranked 40th on this ranking. India is also an outperformer. India punches above its weight when it comes to innovation. And India was the highest lower middle income country in this index. Now, if you just look at the output in terms of measures of innovation, one of the most widely used measures of innovation is patenting. So China's patenting is approximately 55.6 per billion of GDP, adjusted for purchasing power parity. So China's patenting output is more than 20 times that of India's. Now, a lot of the patenting that takes place in China is actually of poor quality. And this is one of the criticisms of using patenting as a measure of output. So if we restrict ourselves to, let's say, quality patents, those that are in what are called the Patent Cooperation Treaty. So these are patents that provide protection to a patenter in multiple jurisdictions. Even there, China's output is actually fairly high. And here, China is about, I would say, 13 times India in terms of output. If you look at the highest quality of patents, which are called the triadic patent families. These are patents that are filed in the US, Europe, and Japanese patent offices. There again, China's output is more than 10 times that of India's. When it comes to science and technology articles and science and technology output, again measured per billion of GDP, China is roughly twice that of India. So this is the the trajectory over the years in terms of the rankings of the two countries on the Global Innovation Index. I would like to draw your attention to 2008, when India was actually more highly ranked than China. But China has since 2008 made remarkable progress to the point that it is ranked 11th in the world today. India's innovation rankings went down consistently until 2015, and since then they have been on a marked improvement trend. So these are the total domestic patent applications. Here we are looking at a 100:1 ratio almost between China and India. And most of the patents that are filed in China are by residents, meaning they are Chinese companies that are filing these patents. Whereas in India, most of the domestic patent applications are actually being filed by companies that have headquarters outside India, such as IBM, Intel, Cisco, and so on. So this is the graph for the triadic patent family. These are the science and engineering articles. The blue line, the line that is that has the sharpest upward slope is the one that represents China. You can see that by 2016, they were already number 2 in the world, behind the United States, behind the EU in terms of science and engineering articles output in number. But if you once again, if you look at the quality of output in the top 1% of cited publications, there again, China has shown remarkable improvement over the years. India is improving, but at a very steady pace. If you look beyond patents, and this is something that all of us can relate to, during the last few years of my stay in Shanghai, whenever I had to travel to Beijing, I never used to fly. I used to take the high-speed train. It used to take me there in 4 hours, and it was a very comfortable journey. I knew, exactly when I was going to get there, and I could move about on the train and so on and so forth. In terms of the most installed bandwidth, China by 2014 represented 29% of the installed bandwidth globally. The world's largest internet population, and most of the Chinese internet users access the internet on their mobile phones. Since roughly 2015, it was very rare for me to use either banknotes or the Union Pay card to make payments in China. I was a user of WeChat Pay, I still am, and I used to make all my payments using WeChat Pay, which was very widely accepted everywhere. And of course, we know that India has also achieved remarkable diffusion of the mobile payment system through UPI. If you look at e-commerce, China is by far the largest in the world. The e-commerce volume in 2021 was 35 to 40 times what we do in India. So 67 billion in India versus nearly 2.8 trillion in China. If you look at the number of artificial intelligence patent applications, China is second in the world to the United States, but the output is growing at a faster rate than in the United States. If you look at the number of artificial intelligence companies, China is again second only to the United States. India is not doing too badly there. If you look at the share of machine learning patents, China is second to the US. And if you look at AI-related publications, there are some areas of AI, such as deep learning and artificial intelligence, where China is actually ahead of the US. The second, so the mechanism number one. So we've looked at, until now, we've looked at, China's technological progress. As I said, I don't claim that this is an exhaustive perspective on China's technology development and innovation development, but it's just it gives us an idea of the kind of development that is taking place, both in consumer-oriented technologies as well as in business-oriented technologies. So when it comes to consumer tech, there is no doubt that China is the leader in the world, ahead of the US, in terms of the adoption by consumers of technology in their daily lives. Whereas when it comes to enterprise tech, the US is still ahead of China. And when it comes to enterprise tech, the US's leadership cannot be fully understood without understanding India as the back end to the US's leadership in enterprise tech. So the US would not be the leader that it is today if it did not count on India as a partner for its back end development of the technology. I think you all know that many of the largest US tech companies have larger workforces in India than in their home country. A matter of great political sensitivity, and that is not well publicized, of course, intentionally by the American company. So let's talk about the resource allocation, the strategic intent, right? So this is a very clear goal of the Chinese government from the very beginning, for the past 4 decades, that China has to upgrade itself technologically, and they have put their money where their mouth is, basically. So post 2008, if you take the spending on GERD, gross expenditures on research and development, this includes both public expenditures and private expenditures. If you take 2008 as 100, by 2016, China had almost tripled its expenditures on research and development. Most advanced countries actually cut back. They were spending less in 2016 than they were in 2008. Some countries, such as France, increased their expenditures slightly. Korea did increase it significantly. India's increase was again, very, very marginal. But really, China's catch-up with the advanced technological nations of this world has happened post 2008, post the 2008 crisis. China is currently spending nearly 2.5% of its GDP on research and development, whereas India has actually gone down a little bit. It's currently something like 0.65%. So it's in just percentage terms, China is spending about 4 times what India is spending. But then if you take into account the fact that China's GDP is about 5 times that of India, China is spending $20 for every dollar that India is spending on R&D. So one of the questions that we should ask ourselves is, how is it that India is doing so well? In other words, ranked 40th in the world, and ranked first in the world amongst lower middle income countries with such a paltry investment in R&D? And that's a question that I think can generate a lot of debate. One of the things that China has not been good at is in the efficiency of its expenditures. So if you look at the amount of capital that is invested in China to produce 1 percentage point increase in GDP, that is much higher than what India invests to generate 1 percentage point increase in GDP. So India, follows a much more of a frugal approach to innovation. If we can call it that, because I don't know to what extent we have a national policy on innovation and technology. But to the extent that there are many agencies that are involved in both public and private in technology development, we definitely follow a much more frugal approach to innovation than China. Today, China is spending the most in the world, even more than the US, in AI, in developing artificial intelligence tools and solutions. And the revenues of the Chinese AI companies have been growing at quite a dramatic pace. So the size of the AI funding received by Chinese companies was about 2.6 billion in 2016. And China had roughly 700 AI companies. One of the interesting things that we looked at, at CEIBS was the investments by Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent, the BAT of China, in startups, basically. And these were actually maybe no longer as much as they were before, very cash-rich companies generating significant surpluses. And they had two programs. One was outright acquisition of startups that had shown some traction, and that these companies felt were promising. And then they had an investment program that was not an acquisition program, an investment meaning that they took minority stakes in a large number of companies just to get a window into new areas of technology development. And it's not just these three companies that are mentioned in this slide. There were others such as NetEase, Meituan, Xiaomi, all these, Huawei, of course. So all these companies have investment arms, and they are continuously investing, or they were continuously investing in startups and early stage companies. Just as a data point for you to think about, so in venture capital, we make a distinction between financial venture capital and strategic venture capital. So financial venture capital is the funding that is provided by purely financial investors, such as Sequoia, for example, is a pure financial investor. They've made a number of investments in India, and they are looking for a financial return on their investment. Strategic investors such as Xerox or Intel or Cisco or Baidu or Alibaba, they are not looking only for a financial return on their investment, but they're also looking for a strategic return. And historically in the US, the ratio of financial venture capital invested to strategic venture capital invested has been about 90 to 10, right? 90% venture capital every year is provided by the financial investors, roughly 10% by the strategic investors. In China, by 2017, 2018, the strategic investors were investing 35 to 40% of the venture capital that was being invested in China. So the corporations in China were actually very, very active investors in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. So just to give you an idea of the large sums of money that China has been investing in to promote innovation and technology, both the government as well as the private sector. The second mechanism I want to talk about is investment in human capital. And just to give you, share this with you as an example, you must be very familiar with these two big projects that China undertook. One was in 1995 called Project 211 to develop the national key universities. And they invested roughly $2.2 billion between 96 and 2000 in Project 211. And there were 118 universities that came under this list. In 1998, Project 985 was initiated that wanted to develop more elite universities. And under this program, in which both the central government and the provincial governments participated, some of the leading Chinese universities received significant sums of money. So Peking and Tsinghua each received about $1.8 billion. Can you imagine, one IIT receiving something like this, right? Or JNU or Delhi University receiving 15,000 crores, something like this, right? In 1 year from the government. Fudan and Shanghai Jiaotong received about 1.2 billion. And there were about 39 universities in this list. A lot of this investment obviously went towards infrastructure development, but a lot was also invested in promoting research and in hiring high quality staff. I just wanted to share with you some insights into the extent to which the Chinese government can go in order to achieve its ends. As we say in China, the ends are so important that sometimes the means become totally secondary, right? So I think you all know that Peking University is a public university. It's considered to be the Harvard of China. And at the Guanghua School, which is a school of management, they introduced a dual track faculty policy in 1999, according to which they would recruit primarily foreign minted PhDs. In other words, those that had received their PhDs outside mainland China. And these faculty members would actually received dollar-denominated salaries, which were higher than the salaries received by the legacy faculty, in other words, those that joined before 1999. But the other side of the coin was that these faculty members had to meet much higher expectations in terms of research output in international peer-reviewed journals. Now, I don't need to tell you what would happen in India if such a scheme were to be introduced by a public university in our country, right? The whole university system would probably come to a standstill. And I'm not suggesting that we should do this, but I just want to share with you, how determined the government can be, when they want to achieve a certain end, they can go to this length to achieve that, right? So between 2001 and 2007, this is an article that was written by a former colleague of mine, Dean Shu. 46 foreign minted faculty were recruited at Guanghua. I actually checked a few days ago on the Guanghua website. I would say roughly 80% of the faculty today are from outside mainland China, got their PhDs from outside mainland China. So mainly the US, Canada, Western Europe, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and Australia and New Zealand, okay? Over time, the compensation gap has disappeared, but by and large, today what the faculty that remains is the post-1999 faculty. So it's not just the investment in upgrading the higher education institutions, but it's also the benchmarking. So in my area of research is entrepreneurship, and there is one very well-known scholar by name Scott Shane who teaches at the Case Western Reserve University. And he's perhaps the most cited entrepreneurship scholar. So he gets invited every year by a couple of Chinese universities to spend a few weeks during the summer with them and to teach one doctoral seminar in the university. And they offer to him, they pay him very good compensation. I think several tens of thousands of dollars for his stay there for a few weeks. And then they put him up in very comfortable accommodation, and his food is taken care of, his ground transportation is taken care of. And they request him that when he goes back, that he select one or two of the most promising Chinese PhD students, and he take them back to the US. The Chinese university pays for their travel and their accommodation. And the message to him is, just give him a table and a chair in your department, and please work with him to him or her to publish one or two top-notch papers, right? So there is this desire on the part of the universities now to actually to achieve these outputs in terms of publications. So during the first 3 years of my stay, I moved to China from Spain. And as you know, Spain is a very high tax country. So I was paying, my highest marginal rate was about 46%. So my bonus at the end of the year in Spain used to get taxed at 46%. So when I went to China, I was designated a foreign expert. And for the first 3 years of my stay in China, I did not pay a single yuan in taxes. So this was their way of attracting foreign professors to their higher education institutions to try and upgrade these institutions. Of course, many of my colleagues are of Chinese origin. My former colleagues now are of Chinese origin, but they may today be holding passports, US, Canada, Western European passports, Australian passports. So they also benefited from this favorable tax treatment. I think you all know of the 1,000 Talents program. During the first 10 years, I think from 2008 to 2018, this program had successfully attracted about 7,000 top researchers from mainly Western countries back to China. Most of them were of Chinese ethnicity. People who had been born in mainland China and had gone abroad to study and had decided to stay back. And of course, there were other programs such as the Junior Talent Program. Difficult to evaluate the success of these programs because there's not much data transparency. But suffice it to say that there've been a number of initiatives that have been launched by the Chinese government to attract talent. So this is the rate at which the Chinese students who go abroad to study are returning. So you can see that the pace actually picked up, post 2005. And I'm not going to suggest that these, Chinese students or graduates return to China because of the programs that I mentioned earlier, such as the 1,000 Talents program. I think most of them came back simply because they could see that their country was growing very fast. There were very attractive employment opportunities. The compensation packages in China have been going up and up and up. For example, I'm familiar with companies and their compensation packages, private companies. And I know that for middle and senior managers, very often the compensation exceeds what is paid in Western Europe. So talent is scarce relative to demand in China even today. And the companies are willing to pay top money to attract this talent. This is something that you have not seen yet in India, for example, right? So the rate of returnees is not as high in India as it is in China. Many of my colleagues at the China Europe International Business School gave up tenured positions in in the US, Canada, Europe to come back. I'm assuming that you can see my screen very well. Please confirm that, Pankaj. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Your screen is.
So this is the rate at which the people are returning, right? So the third mechanism, I'll call it trade and investment policy. So China, as you know, is the largest manufacturing country of the world, with an output in 2018 of approximately $4 trillion, followed by the US, 2.3 trillion, Japan, 1 trillion, Germany, 806 billion, Korea, 459 billion, and India is sixth with 412 billion. So post China joining the WTO, they have really become a very open economy, at least as far as tariffs are concerned. Whether they are open, across the board, I think is a different question, and we can discuss that. For example, one of my complaints when I was in China, and I published articles in the Chinese media on this, is that it is really very unfortunate that the Indian pharma companies have not been allowed market access in China. And the response of the Chinese has always been that the barriers that Indian pharma companies face are not specific to India, and which is true. But there's hardly any other country that has a generic pharmaceutical manufacturing capability that India has. So while the measures may not be India specific, India is the country that feels the pain the most. So we can discuss that later. But at least in terms of tariffs, China has one of the lowest tariff rates in the world. India's the weighted average tariff rate, China's is about 2%, a little over 2%. India's is about 6.2% currently, I believe. And China has been successful in attracting massive quantities of foreign direct investment. So the stock of foreign direct investment in China in 2021 was about $3.6 trillion, which is about 7 times what India has been able to attract. So something that I think was not fully appreciated by people outside China is that most of the exporters in China were actually multinational companies. So when I arrived in China in 2007 to work, that was not my first visit to China, but when I landed there to work, one of the things that I heard very often was that it is not so much that China sells to the world as much as that the world comes to China to buy. So roughly, about 3/5 or 60% of China's exports were by companies that were either wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign companies. In the second paragraph, we refer to OECD WFOEs, right? WFOEs, I think you all know, are wholly foreign-owned enterprises, or Sino-foreign JVs, joint ventures, right? So it was the foreign invested companies, fully invested or partially invested, that were exporting the bulk of what was being exported from China. And these were companies that were going to China, setting up production plants, and buying up all the output of these production plants. This began to change in a marked way post 2008, when demand for Chinese goods in the advanced markets actually collapsed. And then China was forced to look for other markets for its products, Latin America, Africa, and other Asian countries. And closely related to this, the foreign investment in China is also what we refer to as processing exports. So roughly 58 to 59% of China's exports, by the early part of the 21st century, were processing exports. In other words, goods were being imported into China into a bonded area, or when I say goods, raw materials and intermediate goods were being imported into China into bonded areas. They were being processed or assembled into finished products, and they were being exported. Now, we have known this in India for many, many years. In my first job in 1986, I worked for a Spanish company, and we had a joint venture. We had a partnership with an Indian company called the MJ Group, and they had an assembly plant in the Kandla Free Trade area in Gujarat. And we used to export battery components, for car batteries. So we used to send across lead plates, and the plastic containers, and they used to be assembled into batteries in Kandla, and then they used to be exported to the Soviet Union. In those days, the Soviet Union still existed, and so the Soviet state buyers used to buy the product. Now, why did this happen? This happened because, the Soviet Union ran out of hard currency to pay the Spaniards directly. They were doing it earlier, but they were not able to do it, after 1985. I think they said, we've run out of dollars. So why don't you route your exports through India? And in fact, it was the Soviet Union that suggested to my Spanish employer the Indian partner that they should partner with, because the same Indian partner had also partnered with companies like Eli Lilly and Imperial Chemical Industries in the UK to send across pharmaceutical products and chemical products to the Soviet Union. So we have known the importance of processing exports, but China actually, got a foothold into the global export market through processing exports. And you can see already by 2006 that the percentage of processing exports is going down. And this continued to fall, and today it's maybe in the high 20s. So what has happened is a very natural process, is that through a process of import substitution, the raw materials and intermediate goods that were being imported are now being produced in China. More and more of them are being produced in China, and the import component of the processing trade has actually shrunk significantly. But again, it is the openness, it is the trade openness that has allowed this to take place. The other thing, of course, is we measure what we call the sophistication of a country's exports. So if you look at the top 10 categories of products that China is importing, the two most important ones are, you may not be able to read this, so please let me read this for you. The first one, which is the top graph, is electrical machinery and equipment and parts thereof, sound recorders and reproducers and television. So these are a custom, the customs definitions of product categories. Okay. The second most important one, which is the yellow line, is machinery, mechanical appliances, nuclear reactors, boilers, parts thereof. Okay. Way down, you see products that China was traditionally good at 20 years ago, right? Things like articles of apparel and clothing accessories, knitted or crocheted, right? Articles of apparel and clothing accessories, non-knitted or crocheted. So these product categories have grown, have grown, no doubt, over 20 years, but they've grown at a much slower pace than the more higher valued, the more sophisticated products that have grown much faster. And this again is due to the what we call inward internationalization, right? So in the international business literature, they make a distinction between inward internationalization and outward internationalization. And what researchers have found is that inward internationalization usually precedes external or outward internationalization. So the Chinese actually significantly upgraded their manufacturing capabilities through a process of inward internationalization. And this has enabled them to become much stronger when it comes to outward internationalization. The fourth mechanism is knowledge acquisition from overseas. So if you look at the amount of money that China is paying in the form of royalties for intellectual property through licensing agreements, paying for trademarks, patents and copyrights, this amounted to about nearly $50 billion in 2021. And this has been growing at more than 17% per year since 1999. In comparison, India is paying about a fifth of that amount for intellectual property. Now, this doesn't preclude what Professor Dolla was saying earlier, that that there is also copying and a leakage of intellectual property from overseas companies to China, but that's very difficult to measure. Okay, but suffice it to say that when the Chinese have the Chinese have understood what their technology gaps are, where they are lagging behind in science and technology and innovation. They've been very clear about this, and they have, very determinedly, plowed in resources to narrow this gap. So another very important phenomenon, something that my former colleague Klaus Meyer has been researching for some years, is the acquisitions that China has made outside China, not so much to seek external markets, but to seek resources. It could be knowledge, it could be technology, it could be brands, it could be management methods, it could be production methods. So China's acquisitions, particularly in developed countries, rarely have been market-seeking acquisitions. They have been resource-seeking. They have been more resource-seeking acquisitions. For example, $40 billion to acquire Syngenta, which is in the business of agricultural chemistry. And private equity companies have actually, been, very front and central in supporting these acquisitions. Some of them have been Western private equity companies such as KKR or Morgan Stanley. So, for example, in the area of engineering and manufacturing, Industry 4.0, the Chinese have made a number of acquisitions in Germany. Environmental technology, e-commerce, biotechnology. They've made a number of acquisitions of European brands, fashion brands, food brands, household goods, etc. So, so just to summarize, I will say that China has a very long history of excellence in science and technology. I think we know that. Going back to the 1500s and 1600s, we see some really breakthrough inventions such as the compass, the printing technology, the windmill, iron making technology, cotton ginning, and so on. But post 1980, post reform and opening up, China has identified science and technology as a very, very important driver of growth, of economic growth and prosperity. And they have been willing to put in place mechanisms, and they've been willing to plow resources to make this happen. So before we talk about what the future may hold, I just wanted to stop here and ask if you have any questions or comments or points of disagreement with me. Professor Dola, will you ask?
I think maybe what we can do is if you could just complete the discussion, and then we'll come back to the Q&A. I think.
Yeah. So as far as what the future might hold, it's very difficult for me to say, because one of the things that has characterized China, in my opinion, that has given China this remarkable ability to catch up and narrow the gap with respect to the leaders in the area of science and technology and many other areas, has been that until last year, until November of 2020, China never allowed politics to trump economics. Whereas most democracies, politics ends up trumping economics. Okay, but China never allowed politics to trump economics. And starting in 2020, we see that has changed in China. It is increasingly ideology and politics that is trumping economics. And for me, perhaps the watershed moment was the cancellation of Ant Financial's IPO in Hong Kong, and the systematic measures that China has taken to limit the freedom and the margin for maneuver of the Chinese tech giants, such as restricting the number of gaming licenses to Tencent, not allowing online education and online tutoring companies such as New Oriental to function freely, placing many more controls on companies such as Ant Financial, the Alibaba Group in general, to the point that today I think the Chinese private sector, which has been a very important driver of China's progress economically, and of course, in the areas of science and technology, the private sector is facing significant uncertainty. And so I think it could go two ways, right? So the Chinese government may decide that their objective of ensuring political stability has been achieved now, and now the time has come to boost up the economy again, and to boost up the morale of the private sector and the entrepreneurial class. I think that would then, perhaps help China recover economically and take it on an upward path. If that doesn't happen, and this level of control over the private sector continues to the benefit of the state-owned enterprises, then I don't think the future is as promising for China as it has been in the past. So that's just something that I wanted to conclude with.
Thank you very much, Professor Ramakrishna Velamuri. I'm sure each of the participants would agree with me that the presentation has been rich, both in the statistical data, that has been presented to buttress, the argument of how China has been leapfrogging and climbing up the ladder of science and technology, and of course innovation. Very clear in the presentation, especially focusing on 4 important elements: strategic intent, investment in human resources particularly, and also trade and investment policy and knowledge acquisition, all of which are central to what China has been able to achieve in the last 4+ decades. I think one of the things that you alluded to, especially in your reference to comparing what China has accomplished, vis-a-vis what India has accomplished, you did make a reference to low inequality that China began with, and low social stratification. I think these are the two key elements that have been plaguing the development of science and technology and innovation in India. And I hope the policymakers in India would take note of that and a very important element, and ensure that science, technology, and innovation are truly inclusive. Given the kind of a caste system that pervades, that continues to plague our country. And I think that's where I think we need to really reflect on where our science and technology and innovation stand. And another important I think takeaway for me is the reference that you made indirectly to the manufacturing capabilities that China has, which in a way paved the way for the kind of a rapid development of science, technology, and innovation, coupled with the development and diffusion of these technologies. I think because China has the financial wherewithal, it has been able to actually diffuse those technologies, and that diffusion in turn paved the way for more resources, and which are actually invested in higher education. Especially I was in Beijing doing a postdoctoral study way back in 2004, and then again recently in 2017 at Chengwei and Peking universities, and I could see the kind of investment and the way in which that has actually played out in the way in which China has been able to put together a system, and I would say an ecosystem that has actually led to where China stands today. And of course there are a few other issues that have highlighted. I think those really brought a new dimension to the understanding of science, technology, and innovation in China, particularly focusing on the patents and publications and so on and so forth. And now what we shall do is to have the Q&A in the next few minutes. First of all, what we can do is we have, of course, two participants have raised their hands. And then, of course, there are 3 questions in the chat box. One of the things that what we can do is to first, begin with these, 2 questions from the audience now, and then take up the questions from the chat box. Yeah. Yes. Ravi Muthilingam, you want to start off? And then
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Varaprasad. Professor Velamuri, first of all, very nice to see you again.
Yes.
After a gap of 3 years, and welcome back to India. And thank you for this wonderful, very brilliant presentation, which I thoroughly enjoyed, really, really illuminating. Now, my question is this. You mentioned that China's innovation has been very powerful, particularly in the consumer-facing areas, in technological adaptation, and what is perhaps known as incremental innovation on a large scale. I would like to ask you about how you have seen the progress and what the portents are for the future in the area of scientific discovery and innovation in the more basic sciences, and how you see that panning out, especially since China is facing restrictions in terms of students, in terms of circulation of inward circulation of scientific knowledge, are they past the takeoff point, or do they still have to reach that? I'm talking the areas of scientific innovation. Thank you.
Yeah, you want to take one question at a time, or
yes, I think so. I think that would be
go.
better if I take it one at a time. Yeah. So it's my pleasure also to see you again, Mr. Bhutalingam. We met in Shanghai last time, I remember. So I'm perhaps not qualified to talk about basic scientific research because my contact has been mainly with businesses and universities, and so I can talk about applied research. What I will say is that when it comes to development of the underlying tools, such as operating systems and programming languages, technologies such as Hadoop, these kinds of technologies, China probably still has some ways to go. And I know, for example, that there has been a project at one of the northern military universities for a long time now to develop an operating system that can replace Windows. Because the underlying, if you may have, I'm sure you've heard of the Made in 2025 document that was published in 2025. And there they made their intentions very clear that they wanted to drastically reduce their reliance on foreign technologies. They wanted they wanted Chinese technologies to be, let's say, the ones that were dominating in China, right? But the fact that an operating system, a locally developed operating system, has not yet become viable, maybe is a reflection of how difficult it is to achieve that, correct? And it came as a shock to many people, for example, that Huawei's mobile phone business ceased to exist when the US imposed restrictions on the import of chips by Huawei, that are used in the cell phones, correct? So I think it came as a surprise, not just to foreigners, but also to many Chinese, the extent to which China still relies on some very core Western technologies for its day-to-day operations as a country, notwithstanding the significant progress that has been made in the last 30 to 40 years, right? So one of the things that I worry about is that China has maybe, in challenging the US and in not quickly resolving the trade dispute, China has maybe overestimated its own capabilities and underestimated the resolve of the Western countries to put a stop to this kind of very programmatic acquisition of technologies from the West. So, for example, the Made in 2025 policy document, it was remarkable in the sense that it was actually, they published it and there was no intent at deception. They just put their cards on the table, basically. And an English language version of this policy document was available on the Ministry of Commerce website. I read it. But I think the Chinese never expected the kind of backlash that this document would receive. Soon after it was published, the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China and the American Chamber of Commerce in China published white papers expressing very serious concerns about some of the statements that had been made there, because there were a list of new technologies where China said we want to have 70% market share in these technologies. And the ironical thing was that in order to achieve, leadership in those technologies, China still had to go and acquire some technologies from the West and from countries like Japan. And that's when I think the other countries decided that they would stop playing ball, And so there's a number of restrictions have been imposed on Chinese acquisition of technologies in the US, but also in the European Union. The European Union was slower to do that. And so, we actually strongly believe that openness and a free cross fertilization of ideas is very essential for innovation and progress, right? I don't know how China can continue to on this developmental path if it now suddenly decides to isolate itself from other countries.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. We have Shubhadeep Mandal who raised his hand. You can ask a question.
Hello, sir. Good afternoon, Professor Velamuri, sir.
Hi.
I hope I am audible, sir.
Yes, you are.
Yes, sir. Professor Ramakrishna, thank you for the enlightening session. So my question is regarding two things specifically. One is regarding this US embargo on the chip export to China and the Made in China policy for 2025. So for my first question is, to what extent do you think this US embargo plays an impact on Chinese economy or its effort to achieve some type of expertise in AI and other fields? And second is that, given that the economic condition and this embargo, to what extent do you feel that China would be able to achieve this Made in China 2025 target?
So I think that the impact of the chip embargo is going to be very significant. It will, I think, significantly slow down the pace of progress in many key industries, especially in AI and areas like that, right? And high performance computing and so on and so forth. It's going to significantly slow it down. There was even an attempt by China to acquire a Dutch company that is the global leader in they produce equipment to produce chips. Okay, and so the Dutch government came under enormous pressure from the US to block that sale, and so that sale was eventually blocked. So that's going to play a very important role. The second thing is, I think, although the starting from 2018, the Made in China document is no longer publicly available in China, and I think China has completely downplayed those goals and objectives. I think the intent is still there, right? Because China is a country that is technologically very strong, and it aspires to become stronger and stronger, and it believes that technology and innovation are what are going to determine the superpower status in some sense, right, in the future. And I don't need to tell you the spillover effects that some of these technologies have in the defense area, right? So this is absolutely crucial, for China and for the rest of the world. So I think you will see a quickening of the pace of investment in these technology areas by the US and by Europe, and you will see China trying to circumvent these barriers to the acquisition of these technologies.
In fact, one of the three questions from the chat box relates to this Chips and Science Act that the US, is putting in place with almost, $280 billion investment. But the other two questions, which of course you've answered, the other two questions relate to, one of them relates to a kind of a comparative statistical analysis of science and technology and innovation in China and the US. In fact, you made several references to India, but I think Mr. Debaraj Ghoshal wants to know, how is the scenario when you compare it with the US? That's one. The other question is about India. I think it's from one of the participants whose name is not clear. Why does India not invest like China and other countries in patents? Maybe you could throw some light on these two questions.
Okay, so let me talk about.
Come back to maybe
Admiral Muralidharan. Yeah.
Yes,
So let me answer the first one. That is the how would the numbers look vis-a-vis the US? So in terms of domestic patent applications, Debraj is a good friend. So in terms of domestic patent applications, China has overtaken the US. Okay, and pre-COVID 2019, Huawei was the #1 patenter in the world. Okay, ahead of any American company. But then again, we need to look at the quality of the patents. Okay, a lot of the patenting is done in China. That is done in China is for extrinsic reasons. So there are programs at the central government level and the provincial government level that reward companies and individuals for patents. Okay, and so companies actually receive money once a patent has been granted. And so a lot of the patenting is just to receive this upfront money. We don't really know if the company is actually doing anything with these patents. Okay, so I would not go by the domestic patent application so much, but I would go by the quality patent applications, the PCT patents and the triadic patent applications. So when it comes to those patent applications, I think China is still behind the US, but not by much. Let's now tackle the question of why doesn't India invest as much, right? So India definitely needs to increase its expenditure on science and technology and on R&D, right? So we are currently spending 0.65, but advanced nations are spending upwards of 2%, and I think we should be doing that. But we just don't have the central government doesn't have the fiscal margin for maneuver, right? In the Indian central government is not as rich as the Chinese central government, right? So one of the things that the Chinese say is that we have a rich government, but the people are poor. So the Chinese government is actually very rich. So that's why they have been able to invest so much money into these areas that they consider to be strategic. India has many more financial constraints, but I think given those constraints, India has really not done a bad job. And I think if we increase our expenditures just by a little bit, if we double our expenditures, we may see very remarkable outcomes when it comes to India's ranking on the innovation index.
Yeah, thank you. We have Vice Admiral Muralidharan.
Yeah.
Would you like to?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Very, very, very illuminating talk. I would like to take you back to what you made in the beginning with the kind of why is Xi Jinping trying to put the clock back or not allowing the people to come in to study? Is that going to impact, in your view, the future developments in China? And the second is partly from what you answered right now in the previous question. We have had also very place of higher learning like the IITs and then we had the DRDO, and we had other scientific establishments. But somehow we are not been able to make breakthrough innovations or develop technology the way we really want. What do you think are our pitfalls, shortfalls? Thank you.
Thank you. So the first question was I think the barriers for foreign students to study in China, I think those are temporary. I think once China gets over its obsession with zero COVID, they would like to welcome foreign students back. I don't think that is going to change much in my view, because I think China sees it as beneficial to China to have students from India, from African countries, from Pakistan, from South America come and study there. Okay, because these students then help China build bridges with their home country. Correct. So that I don't think that will change in the future. I think when it comes to India's institutions such as the IIT and so on, I am actually very hopeful, because the reason why the IITs did not produce a very high output in terms of research or in terms of patents or in terms of innovations is because in the past we did not incentivize that. In the past, I'm very familiar with the management institutions in India, for example. So even in the management institutions, I think our management institutions did a very good job of educating, people to become industry ready, and they played a very vital role in India's development. But research was actually not incentivized. Promotions were not made based on research output, right? And so people didn't do research because it was not incentivized, right? So now research is actually being incentivized. There are, for example, the NIRF and other frameworks are saying research is absolutely crucial for the country, right? And these rankings now depend on the research output. There are, many universities now have lists of journals where they want their faculty members and doctoral students to publish. Okay, and promotion decisions are going to be based on that. Increments are going to be based on that. Some institutions, such as the IIMs, are giving very generous monetary rewards for publishing in top journals. So I think that is changing in India. And Indians, when they have gone to countries where research is incentivized, have been remarkable in producing very high quality of research. Even in India, within institutions such as the ISI or Delhi School of Economics or IISE, which have traditionally TIFR, for example, I'm familiar with TIFR because my father-in-law was a professor there. So these institutions have always incentivized research, and they have produced world-class research. So I think Indians are highly capable of producing world-class research, and once you incentivize it, once you put the mechanisms in place to support it, then I think that is just going to happen very, very quickly.
I think patenting as a culture, should also, I think take deep roots in India.
Yes.
That is not really, happened in India.
Yeah, that's true.
Hope, institutions draw some lessons from this. Professors Alka or Hemant, would you like to come in? If you have any.
Not quite. I'm just been learning. All this is so fascinating, and what is really quite an eye opener is this comparison with India. And while Professor Ramakrishna says that he is hopeful, what is this timeline when this hope will finally materialize? I mean, how do you see this moving? Because when I sort of went through your presentation, you were showing the kind of policies that the Chinese have put in place, which actually produced results within the decade that they really focused it on. are we putting in set of policies which would take us, which give us a kind of a timeline by which we can hope to reach Chinese levels? You know, that's the major question. I mean, the optimism can take us only so far, and then we can always say in the long run, China will eventually be eclipsed by India. But then what is that long run? I mean, already people are talking in terms of how we are 15 years behind China in an overall sense. So what gives you this sense of optimism?
So a couple of things. First of all, I think being a democracy, I think our decision making is far more consensus driven. And I think I'm hoping also less prone to shocks, such as what we have just seen in China. That is one thing that gives me confidence. The second thing that gives me confidence is also the size of our youth population, right? So this is something that unfortunately China, as they say, the Chinese say that we have become old before we have become rich, whereas most Western advanced countries became rich first and then became old. China has become old before it has become rich. So I think the demographics of China are actually quite unfavorable, and they're trying to look at different means to overcome that. In industry, they're resorting to far more automation and so on. But ultimately, I think that is going to be India's huge advantage. And the third, I think, is also India's openness, right? So we are a much more open country. And I think Western nations are less wary of India. Although at the back of their minds, they may be thinking that, we have, created a competitor by being very benevolent towards China and hoping that market access and marketization and access to the WTO will also lead to political changes in China. That was the hope of the US business lobby. I encourage you to read a very interesting article that Thomas Friedman has written today in the New York Times, where he talks about this, that the US business lobby, the US corporations actually were the strongest proponents of China. He said the US had the strongest lobby in Washington without paying a cent for it, right? And somehow the Chinese have killed that lobby, because now the US corporations are silent on supporting China, right? So I think by not reciprocating to the West's openness, by not reciprocating to, for example, in my articles that I wrote in the Chinese media, I used to say that India has opened up to China. India has allowed Chinese phone companies to be market leaders in India. At one point, Lenovo was the market leader in India. Huawei was, everywhere in India in terms of its telecoms equipment. But China has not given India market access in pharmaceuticals. How is that going to work, right? How can that allow India to trust China as a trading partner? So I think this, India has a number of factors that I think play to its strengths, and I think India will slowly catch up. I don't think we'll ever grow, at 10+% for 30 years like China did, but I think we will see hopefully a growth differential in India's favor in the coming years as China slows down. And I think that will allow India to slowly catch up.
Venkat, do you have anything?
Sir, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to humbly remind you that we're running out of time as it's already 4:30. So
Sure, Anushka. I think coming from GNU kind of style, we always encourage more time for discussion. Maybe we will try and wind it up in a couple of minutes, in a few minutes. If Anybody has one last question, please do ask your question, please. Otherwise, we will try and wind up. Yeah. Okay. It looks we don't have any questions. I think we have Anantagiri raising his hand. Anantagiri. And you want to ask?
Yes, thank you, Professor. And in this, in terms of science and technology, and the challenge of innovation and university that you've highlighted, but also what is the challenge of basic sciences and basic issues like philosophy? You know, we in contemporary India, we find a very lopsided blindness in destruction of even elementary support for humanities and social sciences. Like Indian Council of Social Science Research is being destroyed. Now, our ruling establishment gives whatever little more money to science establishment. So my query is this kind of foundational blindness, you know, what is your thought on that, you know?
So I think you're right that I think it's not just the government, I think Indian society, right? Indian parents, Indian society, we have been obsessed with certain branches of study, such as engineering and medicine, and maybe accounting for chartered accountancy. But you tell me which parent supports a child who wants to study history or philosophy or sociology, correct? I think that the new education policy for me is a very encouraging development, and because it emphasizes many of the things that we have lacked in the past, right? It emphasizes a multidisciplinary approach to education. We are also beginning to see the emergence of some very good universities that are liberal arts universities, such as Ashoka and Flame, where students can study a broad range of subjects and then decide to specialize. At Mahindra University, we have an engineering school, I can tell you, where we partnered with a French École Centrale, which is a leading French engineering school. And the French, you know, have what you have lamented, Mr. Giri, that India has lacked, which is that the French emphasize the study of the humanities, even for people who are majoring in engineering or the sciences, right, or the hard sciences. And at Mahindra University, we have adopted that philosophy. So our engineering students actually study philosophy and ethics and languages and so on, because we believe that you know, these subjects produce well-rounded citizens, and I think the philosophy underlying the NEP, I think, is broadly in that direction. So I am actually quite encouraged by that, and I'm also quite encouraged by some of the pronouncements of the UGC in recent times, right, giving much more freedom to universities to structure their curricula and so on and so forth.
I'm sure the presentation does indeed underscore China made rapid strides in the development of science, technology, and innovation. But what is disturbing in the present day authoritarian China is the unfolding of the phenomenon of using these technologies, including the new technologies such as artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, and robotics and others for surveillance and suppressing dissent. This kind of a social and political dimension can never be negated or undermined. But my hope is that this model, of China using these technologies for purposes such as theirs would not go global and deeply affect the democratic elements across the world. But unfortunately, we do see some signs of replication of this model in some countries. And that is quite disquieting, quite intriguing. But I think, to me, either the extreme statization or even corporatization of science, technology, and innovation is quite debilitating, as we see, even sometimes Elon Musk, trying to change the whole dynamics of, let's say, debating culture, or use of technologies. But I think this needs to be, checked by a robust civil society and make, both the state and the corporates much more accountable. And I think what I referred to, I think in one of my previous presentations, I think at Bangalore, I think needs a repetition, especially what Martin Luther King Jr. Highlighted. Let me quote with that we can end. When our scientific power outruns our spiritual power, or maybe sometimes social power, we end up having guided missiles and misguided men, or policies. I'm just rephrasing that. But the actual quote is, when our scientific power outruns our spiritual power, we end up having guided missiles and misguided men. But I think we need to draw some kind of lessons, or try and apply that to our own context in terms of policy and the way in which we evolve our technologies. Make technologies much more inclusive and people friendly, and hope all our discussions would at some point add to this kind of trend, that would make technology truly people-centric. So with that, I thank Professor S. Ramakrishna Velamuri, and over to Anushka Saxena for the rest.
Thank you so much, Professor Dola. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Dola for chairing the session, and to Professor Velamuri for his very insightful presentation and remarks. I'd also like to thank the audience for engaging with the speaker in the chair, and the ICS team for their efforts. At the Institute of Chinese Studies, we conduct a seminar every Wednesday, so I'll encourage one and all to head to the website and register for our upcoming webinar. We're also about to host the 15th edition of the All India Conference on China Studies starting the 17th of November. So I'll also encourage and request the audience to register for that conference on the ICS website. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.